Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real honor and a great opportunity for our audience to have the chance to sit down with you and hear some information on the interworkings of NICE and where you're going. With respect to some of the major accomplishments of the organization in the past several months, in September of this year, you released the Value Assessment Framework. It has been noted that these changes reflect a step in the right direction in terms of engaging all stakeholders, particularly in the arena of health equity and looking at patient perspectives. How will you measure the success of this framework? And have you engaged in a public opportunity for comment?
Yeah. So, firstly, to say, whenever NICE introduces new methods or process, we have a quite extensive public engagement opportunity, which is what we call consultation in this country. So that happens every time we change anything, and this was no different. I think what was slightly different in terms of public engagement on this is, particularly with our method, it's really important that they reflect what society values. So in addition to the usual consultation, when we change methods that are reflecting what society values, we do quite a deep piece of listening, deliberative work with the society we serve, which is in England, to understand whether they think the decisions that we are making or the weight that we're giving to certain things is reflective of what they value. So that work already kind of took place before the new methods were put in place, this deliberative public engagement. And then once we had got the methods described, then there was an opportunity for public engagement with all stakeholders to comment on the whether they were happy with the methods and they were updated in response to that. So that's first question. Do you want me to go on to the second one, which is how are we evaluating these methods? Yeah. So what we learned from the deliberative public engagement is that people do value the concept of severity, that they do think it is worth taxpayers, because we're a taxpayer-funded system, paying more for a disease that significantly shortens length or quality of life. So one of the big changes in our methods was using a severity modifier. So what we do with all our methods changes is we track both qualitative and quantitative data after their implementation. We published in February. The first top medicine went through in October last year. And so we're about, what does that make us? About 9 months in. In that time, we've seen about 43 medicines. Of those, about 8 applied for severity, some severity weighting. And of those 8, 5 were accepted. So we've got the kind of quantitative data. We also looked at increasing or kind of the safe use of real world evidence in our appraisals. And so of the 43 that have gone through, almost half, about 19, have used real world evidence. And in 8, it was the primary evidence source, actually. And then the third part, so we had severity, real world evidence, and then we had also additional flexibilities. There, we've had additional flexibilities applied in about 18% of cases as well, around issues such as health inequalities, difficulties with evidence generation, uncaptured benefits, unmet need, those kind of issues.
Are you finding that when you reach out for public comment, particularly with patients, are they different in their ability to engage in this process in today versus several years ago?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said, there's these 2 levels of public engagement. There's a consultation, which we do that very much how we used to do that pre-pandemic. When we do this kind of deep public engagement to understand society's values and whether our methods reflect that, that obviously post-pandemic has completely changed the way we do things. We're able to do things in the evening now, online. We are finding that it's easier to reach hard to reach groups, so we really optimize around that with our the way we design that research project, the way we deliver it. So in some ways, the technological innovation of the pandemic is making it easier for us to reach the people that actually represent the society we serve.
And is there level of advice or their level of concerns with the way that they're able to articulate it, they being the patient populations that you serve?
Yeah.
Are you finding that you're getting more meaty recommendations from patients in today's world? You know, here in the US and certainly around the globe, I think that as an industry, we are getting so much better at engaging patients early on. And of course, as patients must be much smarter and capable health consumers, they're having to bolster their way of interacting with the health system differently. And I'm wondering how much you're seeing that in your process of developing new guidelines. What are we learning more and better from patients today than maybe we did 10 years ago?
Yeah, so we've actually done this big piece of work recently where we've looked at how we engage patients in our guideline development. So what I was talking about before is how we develop new methods, which is, you know, that happens only once or twice every 5 years. But now, if you're talking about every medicine we look at or every guideline we produce, patients or lay people are involved in two ways. We have lay members of our committees who make the decisions, and then we have patient experts who participate in the conversation and the kind of giving of evidence to the committee. And that we've had for many, many years. I think the thing that we've been reflecting on recently is that what patients are saying to us about working with our committees is that, one, the complexity of evidence and the statistical analyses and the length of papers is becoming quite onerous, so that I think all of us involved in health economics and outcomes research need to focus much more on pithy summaries, plain English language description of concepts, etc. So that's one thing. The second thing that we're learning more about is that patients tell us a lot when they speak to us about a specific medicine. But what they've told us is something that we can use again and again and again. For example, we could use it in a guideline. We could use it in selecting a topic for a digital therapeutic. So they've said to us, we want you to use our advice multiple times. You know, don't just use it on one medicine. So there's something about kind of collecting intelligence and reusing it and getting the themes across multiple pieces of guidance that I think we need to do much more of. And then the third thing that they have said to us is we want you to be flexible about the way you let us speak to committees. You know, many of us have got jobs. We can't be sitting there for 8 hours at your committee meeting and read the 500 pages. So, you know, can we pre-record things? Can we join virtually? So I think that's a long way of me saying we've had a very, you know, patient involvement has very, very deeply rooted in NICE from the start. So that the level of kind of involvement and the insight we get from patients has been there for many, many years. I think what we're learning from patients now is that we can get even more value from the advice they give us by applying it across multiple topics, by making sure that they can engage in ways that are more convenient for them.
And I assume more understandable for them as well.
And more understandable for them, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you. That is such a fascinating development, I think, for public guideline developers to really think about how that last stage of the research process, the communication, that we really have a level of responsibility to communicate this appropriately, well, and interactively with patients.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is something we feel so deeply about because we're lucky to not only look at medicines, but we also look at devices, diagnostics, and digital products. And create clinical guide. We're the national clinical guidelines creator. So one of the things that's on our mind is the future is going to be exactly as you say, Patti, way more involved with way more self-care, patients directing their care from home. So we need to think about patients and their carers and their families as one of our primary audiences. And so we need to not only involve them in the process, which we have for many years, but we need to make our decisions and communicate our decisions in a way that is understandable for the average patient or carer or family member. And I think there is a lot for us to do, because we write for the medical audience. And so sometimes our advice can be a bit like a thicket for patients. And we think there's a big opportunity here to work with community groups who are real experts in crafting communications for patients, to make sure that we do that last bit of the transmission much better.
So I'm sure you, as well as most individuals that are engaged in health assessment, have been closely following the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. And it certainly has introduced a sea change in terms of price negotiations between the pharmaceutical industry and the US government, with waves that are reaching well beyond just the top 10 therapeutics that they identified to the full therapeutic area, as well as well beyond our US borders. I am interested in your opinion on the US IRA and how it may or may not affect global HTA decisions.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And as a non-resident of the US, I feel like I can't comment too much on the IRA for the US market. I think for those of us engaged in HTA internationally, the really interesting question is, how are you going to decide the price? Because for us in the UK, as many people will know, we use cost effectiveness analysis. It wasn't chosen by mistake. We had to think really carefully about, we're a taxpayer funded population, and therefore any expenditure on health is going to need to be covered by raising taxes if it's not really opportunity cost neutral. So that was what our whole kind of mindset was around, is that we needed to create a method that was opportunity cost neutral for the health and care system, and therefore for the taxpayer. So I think that's the first thing that's going to be really interesting to see, is what's that guiding principle. For us, it was opportunity cost neutral for the taxpayer and the health and care system. What's that guiding principle that guides their choice of method? And then the implementation of the method of coming up with a price. For us, we've got a really healthy and challenging but constructive relationship with our national payer, where we're independent, we're transparent, we're rigorous, we make a decision, and then we kind of, the price negotiation has got some medicines, the national payer can do additional price negotiations on. And actually having those two parties that are independent with some constructive friction between them is actually really helpful. So that's the other interesting that will be interesting to see, is CMS is obviously both the assessor and the payer. So how are they going to kind of create that necessary tension? And then the last thing, for all of us people who love methods, is just what method are they going to use? It's going to be really interesting to see how they balance patient perspective, quality and length of life, etc., in a community that is not, that doesn't favor the quality, basically.
Will NICE pay any attention to decisions that are made by CMS? And how are you going to incorporate that into your evaluation process, if at all?
Yeah, so probably not for CMS, and that's largely because our decision points are at completely different times. So the NICE decision point is at the point of medicine launch, whereas the CMS decision, my understanding, is it's 10 to 12 years after launch. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing that is happening in this country that makes us more closely aligned with the US is our wonderful regulator, the MHRA, is looking more closely at international recognition and reliance routes, and thinking about how they use the FDA decision to inform their own decision. And so that's a process that is still being designed, and I think is out for consultation now, or the consultation has just closed. So we look forward to seeing how that plays out.
Can we talk a little bit more about the impact of NICE decisions, and do you feel like there is a halo effect on your decisions? And if so, do you consider that in your decision-making process?
Yeah. So in terms of, do we think there is a halo? Hard to say halo, but we do know there is an effect, and I'll talk a little bit about that. In terms of, do we consider it in our decision-making process? No, and I'll explain why. So on the first, is there a halo effect? Lots of different people have studied this. Our Office of Health Economics, our pharmaceutical industry group, and roughly what they found is that there is some evidence that other HTA bodies and pairs do pay attention to NICE. It's difficult to entirely deal with confounding variables and all of this in the analysis, but there is some evidence of that. That on average, negative decisions are more attention is paid to them than positive decisions. And then the question around why people would pay any attention to NICE decisions. Some hypotheses that people have written about are because sometimes new methods are started here, such as the severity modifier. We're often quite early on in the cycle, as we were talking about, so we're usually quite relatively close to market launch. Yeah. We're usually quite relatively quick, so we're sort of the 6th in Europe in terms of speed, and all of our deliberations are accessible, right? the committee happens in public, everything's online, so you can see it. So there is some evidence. Why we don't really pay attention to that is because we really need to think about our remit, which I keep on coming back to. We are here to serve the taxpayers and public of the country that we're in. Yes. So, we're obsessed about the fact that our methods reflect their preferences. We're obsessed about that we do everything in a rigorous and transparent and independent way, that we're not unduly influenced by factors that we shouldn't be. But really how the international audience interprets that, I don't think should be our primary concern.
Sam, what keeps you up at night?
So many things, but so I think my top thing would be, I've been in this job for about 18 months. And when I joined, the conversation was all around rare diseases, accounting for uncertainty, problems with pricing for ATMPs, etc., and timeliness. And now, 18 months later, we're living in a world of the GLP-1s for obesity, the Alzheimer's medicines, and that is the medicines that are for high prevalence conditions with kind of uncertain delivery models. So we don't quite know, who prescribes them, how you prescribe them, what follow-up counseling needs to be given, etc., etc. That's the thing that keeps me up at night, is these high medicines for high prevalent conditions where there is a great deal of uncertainty in both the service delivery model and the cost. And you can imagine that is going to significantly increase over time. And some of our existing mechanisms are not, they're set up to deal with issues of uncertainty in clinical outcomes, which are very important, and we should pay attention to them. But we haven't really asked ourselves these questions of when there's such service delivery impacts, PET scans, spinal punctures, how does a countrywide rollout even look? What does a countrywide rollout even look like?
Right. So you're raising that the process, the clinical approach to diagnosis or treatment, that you need further, I guess, transparency, insight, knowledge of how that's going to happen. So all of the work that's before the medicine is prescribed is what keeps you up at night?
Yeah, so if I were to use the example of the GLP-1s, it's more, if the prevalent population is 4.3 million, as it is, the eligible population, sorry, in the UK is 4.3 billion people, how is it possible to prescribe this medicine for 4.3 million people?
Yeah.
Who does it? Who provides the diet and exercise advice concurrently? Who follows them up? What happens when, how do we follow up duration of treatment effects? So it's those kind of questions that are not answered. Now, they're not entirely for an HTA body to answer, but it does feel like they ask for some kind of thinking between industry, the health service, the HTA body to think about, okay, these are things that either we should think about in the clinical trial design, so that we kind of set up a sustainable model of delivering this already in the clinical trial, or do we have some additional phase 4 studies, which could happen post HTA, to figure out, all right, these are the different service models and how do they actually all work in the health service? Or is there some other way that we should be doing this? And I don't think, I'm not seeing, but I would love to hear from other people if there are countries that have got this completely nailed for these big medicines like dementia and obesity.
And are you asking or encouraging your pharmaceutical industry providers to help you in this journey? And if so, can you give us some examples?
Yeah, well, so I think the examples are, I mean, the two biggest are, the two biggest are dementia and obesity. So maybe I'll give you an example of obesity, because all of this is in the public domain. Is we appraised semaglutide or semaglutide, people pronounce it differently, in April this year. And the setting in which it can be delivered in the NHS, our health system, is only in quite a limited weight management service, because it requires diet and exercise advice to be given concurrently during the dose escalation period, which is 16 weeks. And that's really the only setting that we have for this. But that setting cannot accommodate 4.3 million people.
Right.
So the government has launched some pilots that are starting early next year to say, what are the other service models that we could use? So, for example, could it be prescribed in primary care, by general practitioners in the community? Could we, rather than having face-to-face dietitian, etc. appointments, could we use some digital technologies to provide the wraparound care? What works and doesn't work? Are those folks happy with the prescribing and dose escalation? So that's an example of how I think it could work. And as we see more and more of these medicines coming through, the trick will be, is it possible to bring this even further forward into the kind of phase 3 study period, where we think about the service delivery as we're designing the trial?
It really strikes me that, and this becomes in vogue, if you will, in our industry, in and out over the decades. But, it really strikes me that it's not a pharmaceutical product that's being delivered. It's a full-scale delivery of an intervention and all of the steps before and after. And it really makes me think that the overall mission of a pharmaceutical company is not drug or pill specific or product specific.
Absolutely. And this is what I can't speak with any authority about this, but there are certainly a number of life science industry companies who have traditionally been medicines companies that are looking at digital and other things.
Yeah.
So almost as adjuncts. So you think, and that's also another thing. This is not keeping me up at night. I think this is an opportunity. This is part of the reason why we're so rapidly expanding our devices, diagnostics, and digital assessment programs, because we cannot see a future that doesn't involve hybrid products, where it's partially a medicine, partially a device, partially a technology. So, we've seen this already with the hybrid closed loop technologies. They're partially a device, partially a technology, partially a medicine that we know a lot about. But that's going to become more and more common. And so you need to be able to understand all these different technologies and how they work through the appraisal.
Very powerful statement. We cannot envision a future that we don't consider these hybrid products. So in our last handful of minutes, I know that NICE has a 5-year plan. Can you delineate for our listeners what that is?
Yeah, great. So I think our 5-year plan is to say, already we are one of the biggest medicines, devices, diagnostics, and digital and guideline creators in the world. So firstly, and most importantly, is let's keep that magic. And we think that magic is encapsulated in independence, rigor, and transparency. So we can't dilute those in any way. But the world around us is changing, and the society we serve, as well as the health and care system, have been pretty clear that they need us to be add 4 strengths to our bow. And those strengths are timeliness, usability, relevance, and impact. So I'll talk a little bit about those. So in terms of relevance, we're hearing loud and clear, we need to go where the biggest health gains are given, are likely to be realized, not where the evidence is easiest to interpret. Okay. And that's why we've really jumped in kind of feet and all with with digital health technology. So for example, we recommended 20 last year, and have had to modify to some extent our assessment approaches, but we've also had to develop data collection processes alongside the use of digital technologies, because sometimes they don't have the evidence to fully recommend them. So that's something about being more relevant and going where the innovation is, not just staying in your swim lane. The second thing we've heard is that we need to be more timely. And this is part of what you're saying, you know, the future involves empowered patients. Empowered patients want the medicines when they're, you know, when they get a license. They don't want to wait for HTA bodies. So we've done a lot of work on more proportionate approaches to appraisal, where we keep the rigor, but we strip out some of the unnecessary parts of what we were doing. And that's led to us being about 17% quicker with our appraisals last year, and we're targeting another 15% quicker this year. So we know timeliness is a big part. Don't throw away the rigor, but keep the only do what kind of is material for patients and clinicians. The third thing is more usable. We've talked about this, right? Patients are an audience, carers, family members, as well as the whole specialist work, the whole clinical workforce, which in future will include community workers, pharmacists, physician assistants, and they need pithy short summaries of what NICE says. They can't be reading 50-page PDFs on an impenetrable website. So it's more usable. And then the last is demonstrable impact, where we sort of can't wall ourselves off and go, well, we've given you the advice, whether you use it or not is not our concern. We need to see, actually, are people using our advice? So with this, we're setting up systems whereby we can track our recommendations using real world evidence, not for all of them, but for some of the key recommendations, particularly around our guidelines in key clinical areas. And then if we see our guidance isn't being followed, to understand, is it because there's something wrong with our guidance, it's impractical, or is it there something that the health system could do to follow our guidance better, and then communicate to the different parts of the health system about where the variability is. So I think that's kind of the future. Keep the magic of today, but add relevance, timeliness, usability, and focus on impact.
If we are lucky enough to have this conversation in 2033, a decade from now, thinking about all of the things that are just completely transforming healthcare, from AI to the digital therapeutics to a more engaged and diverse population of users, what are we going to be talking about in 2033 if you're leading NICE?
Yeah. So I've got one problem I think we should have solved, and one thing we're going to talk about. The problem we should have solved is around multi-morbidity, and the problem we're going to be talking about is health inequalities. So on multi-morbidity, the thing that I fret about is that we're still seeing single guidelines, single technologies, single use case, but we already know by 2037, 2/3 of people over the age of 65 are going to have more than one long-term condition. So we hopefully by then we would have figured out both what's the research that accounts for that, what are the package of interventions that can help deal with these common clusters of disease, and what's the service model that people need around them. Do they need more pharmacy input? Do they need more community advice, etc.? So that we should have sorted, Patti. We should be patting ourselves on the back, because if we don't, then that will be catastrophic. The more deep-seated problem that I think we will be fretting about is health inequalities. Because already we're seeing there will be very expensive medicines, some for a small number of patients, some for, thousands or a larger number of patients, that will become increasingly unaffordable in health systems where we can't fund enough nurses. The ambulance isn't picking you up on time. And so that risk of developing this two-tier health system, either within countries or between different countries, that have historically been large markets for pharmaceutical companies, is very real.
Do you envision thinking about an elderly individual that will have multiple chronic conditions? Are you envisioning that you would have a guideline that might deal with an individual with diabetes and hypertension and atherosclerosis and obesity, that you would have a guideline that covers all of those conditions and represents a typical patient?
Yeah, so that is exactly the question we're asking ourselves at the moment. So we have historically done some work on multi-morbidity, and we're thinking about what we do next. But it's hard to know what value added we can bring, because at the moment, really, what you've got is that guideline you described would just be all the recommendations from the different guidelines, plus saying, oh, by the way, these are common conditions that co-occur, so make sure you test for them. And these are the drug interactions, or the medicine interactions you should be aware of. That people kind of already know at the moment. So you can imagine a world, and now I'm completely imagining, where we look at, actually, is there something going on much deeper in these clusters of diseases, where there are certain things that we should emphasize more, there are certain biomarkers that are more important of how your course is going to go, and therefore we should have different treatment regimens. So I would hope that it's not just taking what we know now and banging it all together, but it's that we've got these much deeper understanding of these clusters of diseases, why they co-occur, what we can do at the root cause, what preventative interventions we need to provide, i.e. we know mental health conditions will coexist with a third of them. What do we do early? So it's a bit more being innovative around it, rather than just summarizing what we already know.
Well, I am so excited of the opportunities that are before us. I think me being in the industry for almost 40 years, we had a very slow on-ramp into placing a flag in the sand, developing guidelines, moving beyond methods to actually assessing whether or not those methods were working. And it feels like to me that in the last couple of years, there's been, what's the word? There's been an impatience with not putting something out there and saying, let's just see how it works and truly implement a learning healthcare system. I think it's quite encouraging in the last 2 years, if we look at the number of guidelines that have been released by major HTA agencies and non-HTA agencies in the US, that there's finally something out there to react to.
Yeah. And I completely agree. And even in small ways, I mean, we've done two small things. So one is we've decided we can't do these big methods updates every 5 years or however often. Is that the world is changing so quickly that we've now moved to modular updates, where we anticipate every year almost we're going to be updating our methods. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that given uncertainties that will abound on medicines, but also actually really importantly on digital products, that particularly our digital products, we're expanding this kind of data gathering offering that we're doing, where we go, you know, this, and this is good, but it's good evidence, but you still need to get this, and this, and this is how we would suggest you structure the trial. So, I think we're seeing all of that around the world, you know, more managed access, more innovation in methods. So I agree with you. It feels like tricky time from a kind of economic and health system and life science business model point of view, but enough innovation, the HTA bodies internationally, that I feel we can wend our way through the through the middle of that difficult needle.
Well, I think NICE is in very good hands with you. I so appreciate your willingness to sit down and most importantly, your transparency and your ability to just open the books on NICE and show how you go about your decision making and the way in which you engage with all the stakeholders.
Thank you so much, Patti. It's been an absolute delight.
Same. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.